Okay, let's dive right into this explainer and journey back nearly 5 millennia to uncover humanity's very first great narrative, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, I want you to drop any preconceptions you might have about ancient literature being, dry or totally disconnected from our modern lives. Because this isn't just a collection of old words on clay. It is literally the foundational blueprint of storytelling itself.
I mean, think about that for a second. What if the oldest story ever written is actually about your absolute deepest fears? Rather than being just some dusty historical artifact, this text serves as a really profound mirror, reflecting our own modern anxieties about mortality, loss, and legacy. The people who etched these words into existence, they were grappling with the exact same existential questions that keep you and me awake at night today.
Section 1. Birth of the First City.
So let's set the stage here in 2700 BC. We're zooming in on the region of Mesopotamia right at the dawn of the Bronze Age. Now, while most of the global population was still living in small nomadic tribes or scattered villages, something absolutely incredible was happening here. We're talking about a massive urban revolution. Uruk was this vibrant, booming metropolis housing tens of thousands of people, all protected by these massive defensive walls. Humanity was mastering bronze metallurgy, creating highly resilient tools, and even building an international trade network that stretched all the way to Egypt and the Indus Valley. And with this massive societal shift came the rise of god kings. Governance became heavily centralized, and leaders essentially evolved from tribal chiefs into living demigods, perfectly blending politics and religion into one unified mechanism.
Now, the technology that made this entire story possible in the first place was cuneiform writing. But what's brilliantly ironic here is that this writing system was strictly invented for, well, mundane bureaucracy. We're talking tracking grain inventories, taxes, and commercial transactions in a rapidly expanding urban world. Yet, out of that highly administrative environment of dusts, mud bricks, and strict commerce, it completely accidentally birthed poetry and literature.
Section 2. The Tyrant and the Wild Man.
All right, so now we meet our protagonist, Gilgamesh. The historical Gilgamesh was a real flesh-and-blood king who ruled Uruk around 2700 BC and achieved lasting fame for building those immense city walls we just talked about. But over time, his real-world conquests were elevated into pure myth. The historical king was mythologized into a literal demigod, considered to be exactly 2/3 god and 1/3 man. But despite this divine pedigree, at the very beginning of our story, he is actually an incredibly arrogant tyrant who brutally abuses his absolute power over the people of Uruk.
Crying out for relief from this tyrant, the people beg for help. So, the gods engineer a rather unique solution, a wild man named Enkidu. Enkidu lives entirely out in the wilderness among the animals. He's this primal force of nature specifically meant to rival the king and keep him in check. Eventually, this wild man is civilized by a priestess, which sets him on a direct, unavoidable collision course with Gilgamesh.
Let's trace this incredible superhero buddy cop arc. It actually starts with a brutal wrestling match right in the streets of Uruk. But instead of becoming mortal enemies, they recognize each other's immense strength and end up forging the most celebrated friendship in ancient literature. Enkidu actually humanizes Gilgamesh. From there, they go from wrestling rivals to this unstoppable monster-hunting duo. Together, they journey to the cedar forest to defeat the terrifying monster Humbaba, and later they literally slay the Bull of Heaven, a beast sent by the gods to destroy Uruk. For a while, they just seem completely invincible.
Section 3. The Visceral Horror of Mortality.
But things take a very dark turn. The gods decide to punish the hero's hubris, and they decree that Enkidu must die. He falls ill and passes away right in Gilgamesh's arms. It is a completely shattering moment. Enkidu's tragic death drastically slows down the pacing of the story, shifting it into a psychological thriller, because it forces the once invincible king to witness the visceral horror of mortality firsthand. For the very first time, this 2/3 god suddenly realizes that the remaining 1/3 of him means he too is destined to die.
Section 4. Quest for Eternal Life.
Devastated by the psychological dread of his own end, Gilgamesh does the unthinkable. He completely abandons his kingdom. He strips off his royal garments and embarks on a desperate, frankly doomed quest. He wanders the harsh desert searching for a man named Utnapishtim. Now, who is Utnapishtim? Well, according to the myth, he is the one and only man to whom the gods ever granted immortality. Gilgamesh is utterly convinced that if he can just find this guy, he can learn the secret to escaping death.
When he finally tracks down Utnapishtim, he is subjected to some seriously grueling challenges.
First, he's told to simply stay awake for 6 days and 7 nights, and he fails miserably. But he's given a second chance. He actually manages to acquire a mystical plant of eternal youth from the bottom of the sea. He succeeds, but then tragedy strikes yet again. While he rests, a serpent slithers right up and steals the plant away. So the crucial takeaway here is that despite surviving all these grueling trials, just a momentary lapse of distraction leaves him entirely empty-handed. His quest for literal immortality ends up being a complete failure.
Section 5. A legacy etched in clay. Now, before we reveal his ultimate realization upon returning home, consider how this ancient text structurally shaped modern religious cultures. In Tablet 11 of the Epic, Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh how he survived a great deluge. He built a massive vessel to survive the flood, and to check if the waters had receded, he dispatched birds, specifically a dove and a raven. Now, if this sounds super familiar, it's because it's nearly identical to the biblical account of Noah. It brilliantly illustrates the immense cultural legacy of Mesopotamian myths and how they echoed structurally through the centuries.
And you have to remember, this epic legacy was almost lost to time forever. For millennia, nobody even knew this story existed. It was only rediscovered back in the 19th century, found inscribed on 12 clay tablets buried deep within the ruins of the Royal Library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh. Humanity's very first book was literally just waiting in the dust to be found again.
So, after all of that, what did Gilgamesh actually learn? When he finally returns to Uruk, empty-handed and completely exhausted, he stops and looks up at the grand defensive walls he had built. And in that quiet moment, Gilgamesh uncovers the ultimate secret of existence. Man cannot achieve immortality in the flesh. Real immortality is the enduring legacy and the structural works one leaves behind in history. His walls, his city, his story, that was his eternal youth.
And honestly, that realization is exactly why this ancient text still matters so deeply to us today. It proves that this 4,000-year-old story is entirely about the exact same existential crises we face right now in the 21st century. The fear of being forgotten, the agonizing grief of losing those we love, just as Gilgamesh lost Enkidu, and of course, the relentless search for an enduring purpose in a life that is ultimately finite.
The Epic of Gilgamesh isn't just a story about a king. It is a profound story about what it actually means to be human. So, I'll leave you with this final provocative thought about your own legacy. If you can't live forever in the flesh, what walls are you building to ensure you aren't forgotten? What enduring structural works or impact will you leave behind in history? Thank you for exploring humanity's first great narrative with me today.